Hey everybody, this is lecture 1.2. We're going to be talking about perspectives and theories. So this is our first lecture where we're really digging into the material with our sociology of deviant behavior. This is incredibly important material, so if you need to watch this again, go ahead and feel free to do that. Most sociology courses are incredibly top-heavy in terms of the sociological theory. This is another one of those courses. Not quite as top-heavy as Introduction to Sociology tends to be, but still we're going to be doing a lot of theory right at the very beginning. Yeah. So there are a number of ways that we can define what deviance is and what deviance isn't. There are two general ways that we go about doing that, or that the world goes about doing it, or that people that think about deviance go about doing it. Some people say that deviance is real, that deviance is an absolute thing, and that what is deviant is absolutely deviant. That's one way of viewing the world. Others point out that some are falsely accused or misdiagnosed as being deviant. And part of that thought, that constructionist view, we'll talk about what that means, is labeling theory, is that labeling is less a function of an act and more of a function of being labeled as deviant. And this whole slide may make a little more sense later on once you understand some few things, but these are the two major viewpoints that determine how people think about deviant. Either people say something's a crime, it's against the law, it's bad, or they say, hey, listen, let's try to understand the people that are doing this thing, right? Those are the two sides of that. So at its most basic, the most basic definition, deviance is the violation of a social rule. Okay? It's not necessarily something against the law, it's a violation of a social rule. So obviously, murdering someone is against the law and it is an act of deviance, right? But, farting in an elevator is also a violation of a social rule. No one's going to be in prison for that, but you might think they're a gross person, right? That's a very minor social violation of a social rule. So, deviance is something that provokes anger, disapproval, indignation. Deviance can be something that accentuates stigma. So, there are different people in different stigmatized groups. People who have mental or physical disabilities, people who are members of minority groups. These people are expected to behave in certain ways in our society. And when those people don't behave in those certain ways, it can create a deviance response in people. And yeah, there's a lot of very interesting baggage right there, right? And we will talk about that later in the course. Another type of deviance is positive deviance. So people that we see as doing great or amazing things, well, those great and amazing things are also often violations of how social rules, of how we behave, of how we act. Yeah, so it's not necessarily always bad things. So, as I touched on just a moment ago with that slightly confusing slide, deviance falls into two categories, or theories of deviance fall into two categories. We have positivist perspectives and constructionist perspectives. So, positivist perspectives state that deviance is intrinsically or absolutely real, right? That there is crime, there are things that are against the law, there are good guys and bad guys. And this is the type of theory that is preferred by police, by criminal justice professionals, by those type of people. That's Those are positivist perspectives, and we will explore a lot of those. And we also have constructionist perspectives. So these are the perspectives of deviance, the theories of deviance that are generally associated with humanities and philosophy. This states that what is deviant, what isn't deviant, is defined by society, and it is preferred. This is preferred in sociology. It's usually preferred in psychology, and a good portion of our material we'll cover in the class is constructionist. Yeah, and if these two don't make utter perfect sense right now, if you want a little more detail, I promise you we will be going into these in amazing detail during this course. So, the positivist perspective assumes that deviance is absolute. And this type of perspective makes it so that you can say, that is a deviant thing, that is a bad thing, let's do something about it, right? And that is very helpful if you're trying to put people in prison, right? If you're trying to stop people from doing things, then that kind of perspective, and trying to do it quickly, then that is the perspective you probably want to use. The weaknesses of the positivist perspective is that they fail to discover biological or psychological traits that distinguish criminals from non-criminals. So it is really tempting for a positivist to say that, well, if they're doing this thing, it must be because they're mentally deficient or because biologically their body does this. They haven't been able to prove that. That doesn't really exist. There is no type of brain that creates a criminal. That doesn't exist. And another thing positivists don't do is they do not recognize changing and the relative nature of criminal statuses. So laws change over time, right? So, for example, there is a major issue right now legally in the state of California and Colorado and some other states where marijuana has become decriminalized, right? Well, law enforcement officers were seeing those people that sold marijuana as inherently criminals. Now in those states, they're entrepreneurs. Well, what do we do about all the people that are in prison right now for selling marijuana? What do we do about that? Should we let them all go? Maybe, right? And that is the kind of social issue that positivists aren't too great at dealing with. However, positivism has changed over time. Positivists recognize social factors as determining criminal status. So, culture does change based on time and place. The majority of positivists do kind of deal with it. Thus, deviance changes based on, time and place and time, however you want to say it. It is also important that we emphasize objectivity in deviance. So, what is deviant to one individual over another? And we need to assume that deviance has intrinsic characteristics that hurt society. So, let me restate that. The positivist assumes that crime is always bad, right? That the criminal is always a criminal, that people who are deviant should not be doing that deviant thing. That's not something that constructionists make that assumption of, right? So the positivist says that if something is deviant, if something is criminal, it is always bad and it should always be stopped. That's really the real cornerstone to positivism. The positivist says that deviance is observable and has an objective nature that can be studied. So, positivists want to be basically super, hyper, objective scientists about crime, right? They want to be able to measure crime and catch crime and absolutely capture it, right? They want to be as much of scientists as chemists are, for example. Um, that's the goal. And early sociologists did believe that they could study human behavior like natural scientists, and that's true. Most of us don't believe that anymore, but originally that's what sociologists' goal was. That doesn't mean we're not scientists anymore. It just means that we do science a little differently now. Today we see human subjects as being people, basically. The original sociologists didn't really view human subjects as being people. They viewed them as being more objects for study. But we still do see deviance as objective and seek a cause for deviant behavior. Some sociologists do. All of this is about a balance of what is science, what isn't science, what it means that the people you're studying think and are capable of making decisions about you. So, the positivist sees deviance as determined behavior, right? So, a positivist might be more likely to believe that deviance is caused by your environment, right? That people in certain parts of town are more likely to commit crimes. That there are both social and physical environments that create crime. And deviance, positivists also believe that humans have a high degree of free choice. So, that humans are influenced by their social environment and their features, and things like broken homes and social class have an influence on their lives, but people are fundamentally making their own decisions, right? So positivists believe that while environment plays a part, you make the decision to smoke meth, right? You make the decision to steal a car, right? That is the assumption that positivists make. That is the assumption law enforcement officers make, right? And this is part of a greater structure versus agency debate within sociology. Sociologists, we argue, do we make our free choice? Do we make our decisions based on our free will, what we call our agency, or are there greater social structures that are influencing the decisions that we make? And that is a very high philosophy kind of debate that sociologists have been having with each other for hundreds of years now. Positivists believe that deviance comes down to three basic assumptions. And here's our good meat of the argument slide right here. Positivists believe that deviance is absolutely real. That deviance has qualities that set it apart from conventional behavior. That deviance can be measurable, right? Positivists believe that deviance is observable. So you can watch somebody and document somebody being deviant. And they also believe that deviance is determined by forces beyond the individual, right? So what is deviant and what isn't deviant is decided by society. However, there are some unanswered questions left by positivists that even positivists don't know the answer to. So why are some groups more prone to deviance than others? Why are certain minority groups more likely to commit certain deviant acts than other people? A positivist does not make racist assumptions that certain groups and certain races of people are more prone to crime than others. They don't make those assumptions. It might seem like they would be more likely to make those assumptions, but they don't. And they can't really explain that. Constructionists do a little bit better of job of explaining it. They can't explain why poor people, for example, are so much more to commit deviance than rich people. constructionists do have explanations for those things. And what kinds of deviance do powerful people pursue? Or do the rich and do the powerful even commit deviant acts? These are issues that positivists have a hard time dealing with, largely because these are issues that our criminal justice system has a hard time dealing with. So, now let's talk about some constructionist perspectives. So we just got done talking about what positivism is, and now let's talk about constructionism. And actually, in talking about constructionism, you may find that you understand positivism a little bit better. So, constructionism emerged in the 1960s due to challenges from the positivistic perspective. So there were things that didn't make sense in positivism, so they created constructionism. Constructionism assumes that deviance is a label, so it is a subjective experience, and that deviance is a voluntary act. So it's based on motivation. Why do you do the thing, right? Constructionism sees deviance as a voluntary act because humans have free will, a lot like positivism. And deviance does not have an intrinsic value. Rather, it comes from people's brains, right? How we define the situation determines what is deviant and isn't deviant. You probably have a different definition of deviance than I do. You probably have a different definition of deviance than your parents do, than a law enforcement officer does. Each of us have different definitions of deviance. And that is based on our time and place in society. Deviance is an act is deviant only because people label it as such. So if something is deviant, it is because society has said it is deviant, or it isn't deviant, right? In the state of California, smoking marijuana is not labeled as being a deviant act. So it is not deviant in that sub-portion of our society. In my hometown, walking down the street smoking a joint, certainly in western Pennsylvania, certainly would be still considered a deviant act. And police and others have a role in that labeling process. That's an important part of understanding constructionism, is that police not only enforce the laws, but police make decisions as to what is deviant and what isn't deviant. What are police going to ignore? Who are police going to let go? And who are police going to arrest? Who are they going to beat up? Who are they going to focus on? That is of interest to constructionists. And constructionists are also say that acts can be labeled as deviant by one group and not by another group. So, what kind of sexual activity is labeled as weird sex and what is labeled as normal sex? Is there a such thing as weird sex? That can vary based on where you are in society, right? Your grandparents probably had or have different definitions of what is weird sex. Is it okay to talk about sex? Then say your 20-year-old gay cousin, right? Different definitions of sex, right? Or drug use, or what kind of shoes are weird or not, or what is fashion and what is not fashion. All of these things that could be labeled as deviant are determined based on where you are in society. And that kind of thinking doesn't really match, is hard for people like police to deal with, which is why law enforcement officers prefer a positivist perspective. Deviant people, from the constructionist perspective, are feeling, thinking subjects that are worthy of dignity. They are people too. So just because somebody's a drug dealer doesn't mean that they're inherently a bad person. That is the assumption that we make from the constructionist perspective. No, they might be. They might be monsters, right? They might be horrible people. But we don't make the assumption that just because they are a drug dealer, just because they're a meth addict, that they're terrible people. And we have to understand how the deviant person sees him or herself, and also how they see him and herself in society, right? The drug dealer might think of himself as like a Scarface kind of individual. Like, yeah, he's super cool, he's super powerful, he's a drug dealer, right? But he might be a guy hanging out in an attic above your house, right? With other addicts, right? That picture on the right actually is a picture, the guy with the hat and the beard in the front, that's actually a sociologist from one of his books. He didn't do drugs himself as part of his book, but he did hang out with people who were doing heroin and stuff. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Really great book. The book's called In Search of Respect. It's called In Search of Respect if you want to look it up. It's a great book. So, some constructionists, constructionists, not constructivists, avoid statistics and surface appearance, and they attempt to take a subjective approach. So some constructionists want to live in the experience to understand the deviance. They use a tool called ethnography often. And this is a difference between qualitative sociology and quantitative sociology. That's kind of the decision. I've looked at this picture a lot of times, and I just now saw this guy right here. I'm not sure he's not peeing on the trailer. That's great. Okay, moving on. The constructionist seeks to analyze how social control agencies define some people as being deviant and carry out sanctions against them, carry out punishments against them. Sanctions can be either punishments or rewards, but that's neither here nor there. We'll talk about that some other time. But we, as sociologists, most sociologists, constructionists, I definitely take a constructionist paradigm, we want to understand the actions of police, the actions of social workers, the actions of the agents of the state, and how they define who is a criminal and isn't a criminal, who will be let go and who is seen as being dangerous and will be shot, right? That's something sociologists want to understand. We want to understand who they're defining as deviant. Why is it that poor people are arrested so much more often than rich people? Is it because... why does that happen? Why is it that mentally ill people get arrested so much more? Why is it that members of minority groups are arrested so much more often, right? We refuse to acknowledge, we refuse to accept, because the evidence is against it, that people, that one race or another is more inclined to do crime. That is not something, that's something we've pretty soundly disproven. But if so, why are there so many more black men in prison than white men? This is something we are trying to figure out as sociologists. But you could also take an integrated view. You can take a view that puts together constructionism and positivism. So both positivists and constructionists are needed to define deviance, because they are both needed to understand the social world. And in an integrative view, you would acknowledge that deviance is both real and that and a label, right? So there are things that happen that are absolutely deviant, and there are things that happen that are only deviant because we label it as such. That's what the integrative view would say. And then the positivist perspective is more relevant in situations like murder, right? Everyone agrees in society that when you kill a child, you've done something horrible, right? That's where positivism comes in. Everyone doesn't agree that you should be put in prison for having meth, even not just marijuana. Everyone doesn't agree on that. That is part of a social construction, right? Yeah. Constructionist views are more pertinent to less serious deviance. So go back here for a second. So if you want to understand murder, you go to positivism. You want to understand drug use, you go to constructionism, right? Deviance is defined as any behavior considered deviant by public consensus. That's how you would define deviance from an integrative view, right? So if society, we all agree murder is bad, then murder is deviant. We don't all agree that what kinds of drugs are good or bad. Therefore, maybe we would take more of a constructionist perspective when studying that thing if we were being kind of more integrated kind of researcher. Each of your chapters has a table a lot like this that gives the summary of the two perspectives, and it talks about the theories discussed in that chapter. I suggest studying these tables in for your exams and your quizzes and all that. So it should be in chapter 1, it's table 1-1. In chapter 2, it would be 2-1. In chapter 3, it would be 3-1, etc., etc. So these are chapter tables to watch out for. And that is the end of this lecture. I know there's probably a lot of confusing material in there. If you have questions about the difference between positivism and constructionism, please let me know. It will become more clear over the course, but again, there's no shame in watching these lectures over and over again. You're allowed to do that. Yeah, so let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the discussion boards.